I'm Chris Terranova, and this is the Generational Exchange. 4 generations, one conversation. The business world is a tapestry woven from different threads. The experience of seasoned veterans, the tech-savvy energy of the younger generation, and everything in between. In this podcast, we'll unravel those threads, exploring the unique perspectives from panelists in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s on today's business challenges. By bringing together these unique voices, we hope to spark new ideas, bridge the generation gap, and equip listeners with a well-rounded approach to navigating the ever-evolving business landscape. All right, fellas, we're back. Happy Earth Day. The panel's all here. Great to see everybody. Let's start with Jeremy. How you doing, Jeremy? Jeremy Davidson is here representing our 40s. How are you today, Jeremy?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. I'll put a little teaser out there that my job search has officially ended, and so we'll share more about that as we can. But we're having a little bit of a celebration today, right?
Very exciting. It's very exciting. Jeremy is off on a new adventure, and we're going to talk about that in future episodes. But suffice to say, congratulations, Jeremy.
And it feeds into our mentoring conversation, right? A big thank you to my mentoring group of guys here. Much appreciated.
It takes a village. We're all gonna move in with Jeremy now.
Yep.
All right, representing our 60s, we have Mark Russell. Good evening, sir.
Good evening. Hello, everybody.
And as always, representing the 30s, we have Rhett Suchu. Hello, Rhett.
Hello, sir. How are you?
And last but probably least, I'm Chris Terranova, and I'm representing the 50s. So let's get on to our topic today. Today's topic is how to be a better manager. On the topic, management can be a double-edged sword. It can be incredibly rewarding, and it is undeniably challenging. But fear not, this episode is packed with valuable tips for both seasoned veterans and our first-time managers. We'll delve into the top 5 things you should be doing, along with top 3 things you shouldn't be doing to become a successful manager. So buckle up. As the old saying goes, being a manager just might be the toughest job you'll ever love. So let's start the exchange. All right. On the subject of how to be a better manager, as luck would have it, the Harvard Business Review published an article today regarding new Gartner research that found managers today are accountable for 51% more responsibilities than they can effectively manage. I think we've all been there. And they're starting to buckle under that pressure. 54% are suffering from work-induced stress and fatigue, and 44% are struggling to provide personalized support to their direct reports. Ultimately, 1 in 5 managers said they would prefer not being people managers given the choice. Further analysis found that 48% of the managers are at risk of failure based on 2 criteria. 1, inconsistency in current performance, and 2, lack of confidence in the manager's ability to lead the team to future success. So that's a lot to unpack, but just in general, as you guys are kind of digesting that, we've all been managers relatively recently. Some of us are currently. Does that resonate with you guys? How does that track?
Yeah, I think that hit home for me. A manager kind of evolves as you move through the steps. I remember my first people manager gig was directly managing a handful of folks at the manager level. It wasn't super strategic. It was very tactical, day-to-day operational, removing roadblocks and cheerleading the team on change management initiatives. But I found that as you kind of move up that ladder, you move into the director level, your people that are reporting to you now are managers, move into the department head role, VP role, and the people reporting to you are directors. They've got managers reporting to them. And you find yourself kind of migrating a little bit away from that day-to-day people management more to the strategic. And where I found your stats there from Gartner's to kind of resonate is that in-between role when you're kind of straddling that day-to-day, the executive team that you're reporting to, where you might be in charge of playbooks or process improvement or P&L reporting, that takes you away from that daily grind, but you still got your direct reports, right? You still got mentoring to do there. You still got some rah-rahing, some change management. So no, I thought that made perfect sense.
Yeah, Rhett, Mark, anything to add to that?
The only thing I was going to add is I think also based on the size of the organization you're with will also depend on the number of roles that you may have, and or are you more of a player coach instead of just being that people manager or the strategic vision manager, right? So smaller organizations, everyone's wearing multiple hats, which is again, related to here in the statistics. But I think that's another element. Some people say, hey, am I supposed to be the smartest programmer or am I supposed to be developing teams? So again, I think every situation is a little different, but that only helps, validate a lot of these numbers that, Gartner was showing in this latest report.
Oh, for sure. It kind of reminds me of our previous episode when we talked about how to get a promotion, right? Where you've got to make sure it's the right opportunity. Are you moving up for the title? We talked about how in, a couple of jobs ago, I took too much on and I was straddling way too much trying to manage all that, despite having an incredible leadership team around me above and below, right? So that really resonates with me because you are trying to do both your job and help grow people, like we talked about being a mentor, trying to get your own promotion, trying to get people promoted. So it's finding some of that balance. But I'm hopeful that, some of the tips and tricks that we talk about today in the episode will help kind of put a framework around that a little bit and maybe help avoid some of that stress. And maybe in a later episode, we'll use that to talk about how you can avoid some of those pitfalls as well. Red, any thoughts?
No, I think you guys hit the nail on the head. I'd be interested to see kind of a deeper dive into the study as far as maybe if they were able to kind of categorize it by how long the manager had been managing type of thing. Because I'd be interested to find out how many people maybe didn't get the guidance that some of us have had, right? And got stuck into maybe some of these don't type procedures, and they were self-manifesting at that point. They were making the job harder on themselves than it needed to be, and it was just a recurring cycle. So I'd be interested on that part, but looking forward to discussing it today.
Yeah, I think that lack of confidence, right, in your ability to lead the team, I think make sure to go back and listen to episode 3, imposter syndrome. There's some really good tips and tricks there about how to avoid that as well. But let's dive into the meat of the episode. We're going to kind of mix things up. Normally, we give you the things to do first or the things to start with success. We're going to start with the top 3 things that we think managers shouldn't do, and kind of cautionary, keep an eye out for these things. Sometimes it's impossible to avoid, but if you can try to avoid these things, it will make you a better manager and make the things that you should do a lot easier. So let's dive into those. The first thing that we felt like you should not do as a manager is micromanage. And what micromanaging is really just, hovering over your team members, making sure that every single task they do is done on time and done right, and you're kind of shepherding it through. You really should be trusting them to do their jobs, and you should be on the side of providing guidance and support, but not a constant oversight. It's almost like you're starting to try to take over your job. I remember when I first started at a role, a couple of roles ago, had a fantastic leader, very gregarious, very smart, very funny, but literally was so in the weeds with everything that we were doing. I almost couldn't get my job done because I was validating everything that was on the list to do, right? And it made me start to question what I was doing. And then I was putting downward pressure on everybody because I had to report back up every single detail to this leader. And it made it really hard, and it made it unnecessarily hard, right? So I think from experience, I've felt that. I've tried not to do it. I'm sure I've done it on occasion, but I think about how that's putting pressure on the people to perform if you're constantly watching them all the time and making them feel like they can't take a step without you, because then it also they start to stop trusting their instincts and then won't do anything without you. And then if you don't want that, you're kind of in a pickle. My 2 cents. Rhett, what are your thoughts on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And I have quite a few points on this just because it's definitely something that I try not to do. And I think everyone should probably take a look and see and make sure that you're getting your full team's input. But a couple points on here I would say are it can hinder creativity and problem solving. So micromanaging your employees can kind of stifle their initiative and independent thinking in a form, right? If you're constantly telling them how to do something, they're never going to try and figure it out themselves and or come up with a better way to do it. I think it generally tends to decrease employee morale and motivation as well. If you're constantly hovering over employee, at least I feel this way. If you're constantly having to tell me maybe what you want, then I don't feel like I'm providing what you need or being able to expand the role as it needs to be. I would say reduces productivity and efficiency as well. So the more time that you're spending telling your team how to do the job kind of takes away from your direct time on being able to do your job, right? So you start to have bandwidth issues there as well. And yeah, I think ultimately it can lead to higher turnover with employees. Highly skilled and motivated employees generally tend to seek out environments where I think they can stretch their wings and perform a little bit. So I don't think they necessarily always want to be micromanaged as much.
I think that last point you tossed out there, Rhett, was spot on, right? Especially if you're not managing entry level folks, if you're managing professionals, folks that are, you know, midway into their career, I don't think there's a bigger turnoff professionally than having somebody constantly micromanaging your work. I, I I thought I'd take the flip side approach there and say if you've got a manager that's not generally a micromanager, and all of a sudden you find yourself being micromanaged, this may be an opportunity for some reflection too as an individual contributor. I know the handful of times, actually, probably not even a handful, but a couple of times that I've had to get into the nitty gritty and ask for daily updates or ask for X, Y, and Z from an employee that was a departure from how I would normally operate. It was because we were having some performance based issues, right? So if you do find yourself the flip side, you got a micromanager micromanages everybody, right? That's a manager issue. But if you're finding yourself with a manager that doesn't normally do that, doesn't do it with everybody on the team, it might be worth a really candid conversation. One of those, we'll call it a Markism, right? The difficult conversations of, hey, what can I be giving you on a daily basis that makes you feel a little bit more confident in what I'm doing as a member on your team, right?
Right. Yeah, no, there's definitely a balance to this, right? Which, you know, we never like the phrase "it depends," but I love your input of, you know, if you have someone on the other side of the fence who just is giving you no feedback type of thing, right? You might have to draw that out a little bit.
Oh gosh, yeah. I think Chris made that comment at one point. He's like, "Don't ever be offended if I'm calling you too much. If I ghost you, then you can worry, right? You want that feedback." And I probably didn't paraphrase you there correctly, Chris, but
No. In fact, I mean, we're gonna talk about that more in depth on one of the later points about being uncommunicative, right? But it can have impact. Mark, any thoughts on that, or should we keep moving?
Keep moving.
All right. So the second one is avoiding conflict resolution, right? Nobody likes conflict. Well, I'm sure some people like conflict, but most people don't like conflict. But when you start avoiding conflict, it can really start to create a toxic work environment. And those conversations that maybe you need to have or should have that might be difficult can really start to fester and create bigger problems. So, really, the takeaway here is address conflicts head on and in a timely manner, always respectfully, always with grace and deference, but don't avoid, right? I think we've all been in a situation where, gosh, if I'd only known, you know, that was a problem, or you find out on a review at the end of the year, you're like, you have to be kidding me. And it causes disappointment and frustration. And, you know, you start to think, geez, I would have, if I would have known you felt that way, I would have fixed it, right? So try not to avoid, if you can, conflict, right? Conflict does not necessarily have to be bad. Conflict can sometimes be very positive and constructive if it's handled in the right way. Mark, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, first off, it validates, Patrick Lencioni wrote the book, 15 years ago, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And one of those dysfunctions are those organizations that avoid the conflict or avoid those conversations. So, from a manager's side, obviously, you need to have that role, responsibility, and accountability conversation right away. Now, if you're a manager and you inherited a team, or you've been having a team for a year and you haven't had that yet, the second best time to do it other than a year ago is right now. So the element, I think, is when you are praising and when you are recognizing good work, if you're not seeing that and you've already identified, that this is what your team needs from you to hold them accountable, then you have to have that conversation, and you have to be willing to, kind of suffer that little bit of an ouch that all of a sudden, oh, this person's now mad at me because I am having this uncomfortable conversation with them. But you as a manager owe it to them. And if you don't give them that information, you're setting them up to fail, which ultimately means you're going to fail as a manager.
Yeah, I think that's right. And if you handle it right, it's not personal, right? I mean, all of us have personal relationships outside of work, but there were times when, as a leader, I had to talk to you like a boss, and we had to make it about business, right? It was always constructive. But I think, to your point, Mark, if you take some of the personal out of it, it can be much more constructive. Jeremy, thoughts?
Yeah, and it's less personal if it's done in private, right? What do they say? Publicly praise, constructive criticism in private, right? I don't think you could do anything worse than put your team on the defensive than chastise them in front of a group, right? It's just not. But there's managers out there. I read the stories on LinkedIn. There's managers out there that do that daily.
Right.
It creates that toxic work environment, and I think I put a note on here. It says, you'll end up culturally with the worst behavior you're willing to tolerate, right? And I think, teams see that. Teams see if there's a bad actor in your group or in another department, they see that, they can feel it, and if it becomes a reoccurring thing, it becomes tolerated. And that's the best you can hope for, right? As a culture, if you're willing to accept that, why would anybody else clean up their behavior? So I think it comes from the top down. And at a manager at any level, I think, has a responsibility or an obligation to their team to address those things. And I would encourage, take it offline, address it on the side, address it separately, take the defensiveness out, take the personalness out. But I think you owe it to your team, to your organization, to the culture you want to get up and go to work to every day, to have those difficult conversations, right, Mark?
Well, and to that point, there's a counterpoint to that in some cases, even though you want to praise publicly and reprimand privately, sometimes if your team sees a bad actor, if you're not raising that in front of the whole team, then all of a sudden the team starts to feel like, well, gee, so-and-so is always getting away with this, and because they don't know that you've done it. So there is a very delicate professional balance, but sometimes you do have to call out, and again, it's not personal, but hey, we have some folks not meeting the team commitment right now. So again, there's that fine line, and there's never a right or wrong answer. But it's, do you understand the whole situation, and then can you address it appropriately at that time? Because that may rally the team together, saying, okay, he's holding everyone or she's holding everyone accountable, to these goals and metrics.
Yeah.
It's a great point. That I think it's very situational, right? I think, to Jeremy's point, most of the time, if you can, right, that should be offline. But again, Mark, to your point, sometimes things have to be called out in a group. One, to make sure other people recognize that you recognize there's a problem. And two, it also says, hey, bad behavior is not going to be accepted here, right? We can't always wait until, we're offline. But I think if you can find those delicate conversations at the right point, I think they will make a difference. All right, let's move on to our next point. The third one is, and Jeremy touched on this earlier, being unavailable or uncommunicative, right? That ghosting or that silence, people can't interpret what that is, right? Jeremy was talking about, I used to have a boss a long time ago, and I would never say it this way now, but he used to yell a lot, right? He was always yelling at me. And I finally said, man, you're always yelling at me. And he said, Chris, you don't have to worry about when I'm yelling at you. You have to worry about when I stop. And it really, I didn't quite understand that at the time. I was probably 23 or 24, but it, I did over time, right? Because I saw him stop talking to people, and all of a sudden they were no longer at the company, right? So that was something that resonated with me. I would always say it better, and I try not to yell, right? But I think there was a point there. But being uncommunicative, being silent, you can't expect people to understand that they're doing a good job or they're not doing a good job. You've got to make yourself accessible. You've got to be clear in your communication. You have to regularly update people on their projects, their goals, the company, what's going on. Make yourself available. As hard as it is, like we were talking about, there's all these stressors and managers are being pulled in more direction than ever before. But if you disappear, because you have your own work to do too, the team doesn't know why, and they're going to typically assume something negative. Mark, I'm going to start with you on this one. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's, spot on. And the data that is supported is in that Harvard Business article. It said 53% of employees say they do not derive valuable outcomes from interactions with their managers. And so managers whose direct reports can't derive value from their interactions are 2.7 times more likely to fail. Wow. So it just reinforces, if you're not communicating, everyone's going to be left in the dark and only bad things will happen.
No, and it's tangible data supporting that. This isn't just theoretical, that data is supporting everything that we're talking about. Rhett, what's your perspective on that one?
Yeah, I think you have to be present. I really like the mantra of leading from the front, right? So this one doesn't tend to, I think, come up with me as much. If anything, I'm probably more on the side of, allowing them to have that space and use their superpowers and everything, and not kind of being overbearing with, how are you doing? How are you doing? How are you doing? They're like, I'm doing fine. And not, well, what does fine mean? I know Mark and I could go into this whole conversation, but anyways, to that point, I think you do need to be present because you are a conduit for your team, right? Like, you are where the energy starts. You're where we just discussed where you need to put some bad energy to rest and stop it from prevailing and becoming resentment among your team. And so you need to be there and be present for your employees. Both on a level, and I think we're going to get in here, but your direct reports and sometimes your skip levels, right? And so you being present and available doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have 27 meetings with your employees all week, right? It can be something as simple as a check-in once a week where you just say, hey, I know you're working on XYZ projects. Just want to make sure there's nothing I can assist you with or get a roadblock out of the way, right? And if they say they're great, and they're doing great based on the reports you got, then maybe it's just that monthly check-in where you follow up with them again and you get more deep. So, but I do think you need to be present and, setting an example.
No, and I think you're bringing up a good point that it doesn't have to be a 30-minute check-in. It can be, a Slack. It could be a text. It can be an email. It could be a quick phone call. Right. It can be any or all of those things. And I think that's a really good point too, especially if you have larger teams or you have a large project that you're managing yourself. Don't make it so formal. Just a quick, how you doing? Like, what would you expect from your manager? What would you like to hear or see? That can go a really long way. I think it's a great point.
Yeah, it's funny to bring up a personal example of it, not to keep going on this, but there was an employee that I had a little while ago that was one of the main points that she had for me on why she found me such a good manager, was because I took 15 minutes once every 2 weeks to meet with her and do a skip level, right? And just talk about how things were going. And it was it was great to hear, right? But when I was having those conversations, I didn't necessarily know that I was having a huge impact on this person, right? But yeah, I think that's a prime example of where being present makes a difference.
Yeah, it's
So
just a simple act of kindness, right?
yeah.
In a way, just being present, like you said. Jeremy, what do you have any thoughts on that one?
I was going to chime in, especially from in a remote world, right? A lot of the teams that we're interacting with, that we're dealing with and working with every day, they're remote. And it used to be you'd run into somebody while you're grabbing a cup of coffee or grabbing a water out of the kitchen, and you'd have that water cooler conversation. And a lot of teams out there don't have that anymore. So, the opportunity, I mean, there's a lot of benefits to having a quick one-on-one with your folks every week, right? They've got roadblocks. They want to hear from you. What are we prioritizing? If there's any changes in strategy or updates, it allows somebody in a leadership position to be as transparent as they can be, right? Just having those regular check-ins. But as you guys were talking through that point, the one that really resonated with me was just that general camaraderie feedback. In a remote world, we don't always get that, right? You can have a top performer that's out on their own that you don't talk to for a week. Um, just that quick check-in that says, "Hey man, you're doing a great job, right? Is there anything? Can I get you any information?" I think that's invaluable.
No, 100%. I think again, these may be a top three, but you can see kind of these tendrils of how all of these things can impact teams. So, there's a lot of good information I think that we've thrown out there, but hopefully that gives you a sense of, some of the main things to avoid that are easy to do. Let's move on to something maybe a little more fun or a little more positive, if you will. The top 5 things to do as a successful manager. So the first one is setting clear goals and expectations. And one of the things that I think could be really useful is, using what's called a SMART goal. And SMART stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. And that helps to ensure clarity and focus. It keeps everybody on track. It keeps everything measurable. Rhett, I know you have some experience with this, right? I think you had it with some customer onboarding. Can you talk a little bit more maybe about the specifics of the SMART goals?
Yeah, I think the best way to explain it is to kind of just go through an example, right? So I went ahead and came up with one for the audience here that could be an example for you.
Right.
And you could really apply this to any industry that you're in, right? But so let's go through SMART, right? Let's say we're wanting to increase customer engagement with the product by 20% during the onboarding process. So from first sign up to first key action. All right, how will we want to measure that? Well, we will keep track of this by monitoring the completion rate of a specific key action within the product. So this could be completing a tutorial, acknowledging a certain step, reading over or reviewing something with the client, right? And being able to kind of check a box as far as, okay, we know this action is taking place. Achievable. We are hoping for a 20% increase. We believe this is ambitious, but achievable by improving our onboarding materials and offering additional support during initial steps. So don't set a goal that you're never going to hit in a million years, because that's not going to help anyone, right? Relevant. This is going to increase customer engagement during onboarding, leads to a higher product adoption rate, reduce churn with customers, as well as ultimately increases the customer lifetime value, right? So come up with that why it's important. And relevant, and then time bound. We will achieve this goal within the next quarter, or the next 2 quarters. It's always important to put a timetable on it, because that, in a good way, kind of pushes you to continue to get it done, right? If you just say we want to increase in 20% and you don't put a time frame, all right, well, when the end of the year comes, you're going to be, well, did we hit it? Did we not? Should we have chosen a new goal at some point if it wasn't working out? So not to go too much into detail there, but I figured people would just like to go through an exercise of how you do it, right?
No, it's great. I think you tied it off perfectly, because not everybody probably knows what a SMART goal is. So you just kind of gave a clear example showing how smart you are, right? And ladies, he's single.
Right.
So
Thank you, Chris.
you're welcome. Well, we got to celebrate these things. Anyway, moving on to the second thing. Foster open communication. Encourage open communication by creating a safe space for your team to share ideas, concerns, and feedback. Be an active listener and demonstrate that you value their input. If you're a leader with several levels of management, or even if you're a line manager with a leadership structure above you, encourage skip levels. I think we touched on it very briefly before, but a skip level is something that gives subordinates an opportunity to talk to their boss's boss, right? And this can be a learning opportunity for the manager, the senior manager, the employee. I used to do those all the time. And I think people were initially scared of that. And we've talked about this in previous episodes, but that's how Rhett and I really got to know each other. Rhett was, I think, 200 or 300 levels below me when we started. Couple levels below me when we started. I'm picking on you today. I'm sorry.
I moved up really quick.
I haven't seen you in a while. It's good to see you. But, we've talked about this, how, that imposter syndrome and getting a mentor. Rhett came up to me. We started talking. And I had offered this up to everybody in my org, which at the time was several hundred people. And I think I had 3 or 4, maybe 5 people take me up on it. But those that did, I opened up communication to them, and I talked to them more and shared things with them and gave them insight. And I also learned a whole bunch about what was going on in different areas of my department that I may not have line of sight on, or was being filtered by the manager's manager, right? So I think encouraging open communication is super important, whether it's with your peers, your subordinates, your managers. Making sure that there is an open dialogue, right, is really important. Rhett, speak to that. Since I've been picking on you, I'll give you the floor. You can feel free to throw it back. But agree, disagree? What do you think?
No, I agree. You're amazing, sir. I would never say anything bad about you. Come on, gonna take the high road. I'll say it after the show. I'll say it after the show.
That's right.
No, I think that a manager, to a degree, is only as good as their team is, right? And what you're ultimately going to fall into if you don't have kind of open forms of communication, or some type of communication pathway for your team to be able to talk to you and each other, is a closed off team, right? And then you have a group of 6 individuals who are all either doing things their own way, or not coming up with ideas together, not tackling the goal together, right? How do you do that 20% increase in efficiency if you got 6 people who don't talk to each other, and they don't know if they really trust you because you've never been open with them? And then that propagates down. Like, let's say you're not the kind of lowest level manager there. Okay, well, now you have managers below you who are learning from you on not having an open communication pathway, possibly, and that's going down to their team, and it can waterfall really easily. So, I mean, I really think you should be open with your team members, have brainstorming sessions, give them tasks to do on their own, like we've briefly mentioned, right? See how they work. Yeah, I think this is really important. I think I would feel really uncomfortable managing people that I didn't have a open channel with. I'd be like, well, what do they think of me? Am I doing a good job? Am I not?
Right.
So
Right.
Obviously not if I don't know, but
Mark, you got something on this, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, I just think for me, it came down to the 3 C's, right? Clear, concise, consistent. Great managers will always probe with good questions. They're always going to make that personal connection. I mean, everything we've spoke about what managers shouldn't do are all the things now that we're saying, they do need to do. You need to care about them as a person first, because then the business parts will be a lot easier. You need to parrot back what you think you heard, just to get that affirmation of, is that what you really meant? Am I understanding you correctly? So that's where you build that alignment. And when you have alignment, then you can have those uncomfortable conversations of, gee, I know you want to be able to do this. I haven't really seen it. How can I help you get back on track? And maybe they're going to come back and say, no, I think I'm knocking it out of the park. So that opens up that dialogue. And when you listen, you're going to drive that employee engagement. You're going to drive that engagement, not only for them, but that's how they're going to treat the customers, right? So if they're not engaged, they're certainly not going to be treating the customers well. And I think the other element is you can't be afraid as a leader. I had one example where a certain, person 2 levels above me would always say in meetings, Oh, you're absolutely right. Yet no one saw any action from that. There was never anything that was changed. There was never anything that was supported as to what we wanted to do as a group. So, people will look and say, well, gee, if I'm giving all these great ideas and they're not taking anything, why bother? And so
Right.
those are the worst things. So again, if you're having those conversations and you're able to take action and knock down some of those barriers or roadblocks, you're really going to have those folks really embrace, that communication, that engagement, and only good things will happen.
Yeah, that's great points. Let's move on to the third one, which is empower your team, right? This is something I find very near and dear to my heart. Delegate tasks appropriately and trust your team members to take ownership. Provide them with the resources and support they need to be successful. We used to have a discussion about how, as leaders in my organization, when it was appropriate to put on your superhero cape, right? And when to delegate to others. Jeremy, you probably remember these conversations for sure. But running in and saving the day can always feel like a great thing. Like it feels like, oh, I took care of it, right? And you may think you're empowering everybody, but it can almost have a converse reaction with the team. It can disempower, and it also puts the responsibility on you as the fixer. We talked about this as well. You don't want to become a linchpin or become what we call a CLM, a career limiting move, where nobody can see anybody doing anything without you being involved, right? Jeremy, I'm going to point to you first because, we've talked about this a bunch. I actually brought this up as I was doing your final reference on your new job. Yay. That this is one of your superpowers, right? Is knowing when and where to put on your superhero cape. So talk a little bit more about empowering your team.
I think this is where, as a leader, you've got an opportunity to really let folks shine and potentially get ready for that, like our last podcast, that upcoming promotion, right?
Right.
I know your bonus item for today's discussion was how do you take time, how do you take care of yourself as a manager, and I think that ties really nicely into number 3, being able to empower. We spent a little bit of time talking about taking time off and understanding that work-life balance a couple of episodes ago. But one of my fondest memories of working with you and Rad at that last ed tech company was a trip. I took a 2-week vacation in the fall, and we had a brand new initiative. I had spent the previous month outlining everything. We had the playbook all set up, and this is what we're going to do. We're going to do X, Y, and Z, and we're going to engage with our customers differently. And the kickoff was the day I was supposed to be leaving for my vacation. And the guy, the team, Rhett and Tom and David and Maddie, they stepped up to the plate and they said, okay, we got this. And for the next 2 weeks, they were on the leadership meetings. They were on with you. They were handling the day-to-day of this rollout. And when I came back, everybody was I probably shouldn't put words in Rhett's mouth, but everybody was over the moon excited. Hey, this thing worked. It went off without a hitch. We handled it. We rocked and rolled. We had fun with Chris. It was phenomenal. It's one of my best memories of working there. And that was the team stepping up to the plate and grabbing a hold of that opportunity. So,
You had to empower them to do that, right? And that's the whole point is you gave them the ability to succeed, right? You set them up to succeed, and then you stepped away. Rhett, from your perspective, how did that go?
Yeah, I don't know if I when you came back I said we had so much fun with Chris. But
Fun's probably a strong word, right? Yeah.
No, I mentioned this when I can't remember which episode we were talking about, Jeremy, but again, this step of empowering your team is so important for their growth. There was no bigger compliment to me when working for Jeremy from when he took that trip, right?
Yeah.
And the only call I got from him was one day from the top of a mountain, and I was like, everything's going fine, stop calling us, right? And he's like, oh, okay, sure, and went back to his thing. But no, I mean, that was a critical step, I think, for the managers in that group to give us that confidence, to then when we continued to grow, right? And all of a sudden we were in charge of our own regions without like you watching over us, we were empowered and felt like we could do it because we'd already done it. Right. So, yeah, I think this is huge, especially as a manager, because that's what you're getting into, right? You're trying to empower people in your team. So,
And we would, there's no way we would have been able, we 10x'd over those 4 years, and there's no way we would have been able to scale and handle that kind of new customer volume
no.
if we didn't have that autonomy, right? If the regions weren't running their own show. I mean, it was just it was a confluence of excellence, right?
Everyone had to grow at such a
Right.
fast rate, you know? So,
Well, I think you guys just hit on the whole purpose of this podcast, right? Is looking at that perspective or that issue from different perspectives, right? I think that's what is great about the fact that we've all worked together. Like for me in that example, because we had a relationship through skip levels, because I trusted Jeremy, I trusted his team, right? So I was able through that example as well to feel like it was okay for Jeremy to step away at the start of that initiative because I knew his team had it, right? So I think again that is the epitome of this podcast. So that makes me happy. Mark, anything to add to that one?
Well, to that last example, it sounds like they had some great leadership development coaching to that point. But no,
Mark was our leadership coach for those who don't know. And yes, they did have great leadership coaching.
No, but I think as we shared a couple of weeks ago, where I found it working for me is, I didn't have to be the smartest person in the room. So the last team that I helped build was a training team, and I was able to blend a lot of subject matter experts along with educators. We made sure we collaborated with a couple of strong instructional designers until I could get budget to actually hire a few on my own. And so since I didn't have any of those talents, it was easy for me to let go and let them do and let them be empowered, with support and collaboration. I taught them how to go deep in discovery with our internal customers to make sure we were building out what they needed from a training perspective, but they were responsible for developing and delivering, and then the feedback loop, right? So those are all the things that, again, if you're strategic and you're able to handle those things and find the right people, it makes it real easy to empower them.
Well, and thank you for saying that, because that takes us to number 4, which is provide regular feedback and coaching, right? Which we've just been talking about. But one of the things that I think I would stress very strongly is don't wait for an annual review or a review period. Make sure, like we talked about in being a good communicator and not being uncommunicative, make sure you're providing constructive feedback. You're giving coaching opportunities all the time to make sure that your team is growing and they have the ability to improve. I always stress regular one-on-ones. I think all of us, and Mark, you taught me that, is having a regular one-on-one with the team. It gives the team an opportunity to talk to you directly, get that kind of ongoing adjustment rather than these big seismic shifts at certain periods of the year. And it also gives you that opportunity to coach, to mentor, to grow, to get feedback, all of that happening in real time. And if you do that, you're constantly on an iterative improvement process rather than having these, once a year, hey, you need to do this differently, or yeah, you did that great. Make sure you're talking to people all the time, right? I think that's really important. Jeremy, what are your thoughts on that?
110%, right? That annual review time is the wrong time, hands down, for a surprise. We used to spend quite a bit of time on that, Red, as a department, right? Talking about, okay, this is our opportunity to shine, right? We're talking about our wins, we're talking about what we did to grow the business and grow the department. We're not having conversations at all about performance. If there's performance related concerns, they come up in real time. And we had a good example of a department while we were there that wasn't doing this effectively. And push came to shove, individual contributors' performance had degraded down over a period of a couple of months. And when that director finally pulled up with that individual contributor, it was time to talk about a performance improvement plan. They found out that individual contributor's family had been in a terrible car accident months before, and had lost a family member. 100% attributed to the performance. I mean, obviously, right? I mean, that's life. That's but because that regular touch base and communication wasn't there, it was being interpreted as a performance issue. And I think 110% avoidable, right? So that would be my call out. I couldn't give you enough thumbs up on that. Annual review is the wrong time. Should
right.
never be a conversation about performance that's a surprise for the employee, right? Like that. There's I don't know. You're failing as a manager if you're using that as an opportunity to bring up areas of improvement, right? That should just come up real time. So
Rhett, what are your thoughts on the feedback or what Jeremy's saying?
Yeah. No, I agree with all of it and want to kind of, I guess, impress on people that a year is a very, very long time in the business world. Maybe not if you're building out a 5-year plan on where you want the company to be, right? But I mean, to set a goal at the beginning of the year and not have any type of, hey, okay, let's break this into quarters, right? So I'm going to take this year-long goal and I'm going to break it into what I kind of want to see per quarter. Okay. And then, so my contribution to this goal is X. What are my team members' contributions, right? What are my leads? What is their kind of role in this? Let me talk to them about a quarterly type of goal, right? If we want to look at performance, let's look at it on a smaller scale. So we not only don't have to wait an entire year to maybe look at a performance thing, which again, you never want to do, but two, you can measure it in quarters and you can actually have more real-time input and pivotability, if I can use that word, to be able to kind of change if it's not working, right? If by end of Q1 you're only an eighth of a way to your goal, are you going to get there by the end of the year? Maybe not. So I think that both from a improvement and kind of coaching mentality, but also from to Jeremy's point, those one-on-ones that you're having, they're not always strictly business focused. Again, you never prod too much with your employee, but you always leave that door open as far as like, how are you doing? Are you struggling, right? If they seem like they're struggling, it's okay to offer a hand if they're willing to open the door and talk to you about it, right? So
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Mark, any thoughts on that?
People want to talk. I mean, you have to, again, active listening. We've talked a lot about very similar themes. I'll talk to people about 5 coaching conversations, right? First conversation, the role and responsibility. Secondly, and you mentioned it earlier, Chris, that little quick connect. Hey, how's everything going? Red light, blue, green light, yellow light. Tell me about it. You have your regular check-in on a regular cadence. Then you do your developmental coaching as they want, or you have to set aside some time to do that developmental coaching, because the last thing is that annual review. That becomes a little bit more formal, but again, there should be no surprises.
No, that's right. And, I think adding that little statement that you always said to us, right, which initially I used to drive me crazy, but then I came to look forward to, was what magic did you do today, right? It's a great way of, it's like asking, if you have kids in high school, how their day was. Don't ask questions that they can give you a one-word answer to, right? That's the kind of question that if you can start that dialogue, you can start that feedback, you can use that as an opportunity to coach, right? And you taught all of us that that we actually may have created some magic that we didn't even know we had, right? So I think keeping all of that in mind. All right, let's move on to our last point, and that is recognize and reward achievements, right? This is something, again, that I think we all feel very strongly about, is celebrate successes, both big and small. They don't have to be, the gigantic project. It could be a little win. It could be an improvement in an email. It could be all kinds of things. Public and private recognition shows your team members that their hard work is valued, right? And I think that's really important. And it sounds so simple, but it means so much. And it doesn't have to be monetary. It can be all kinds of things. Just positive affirmation, recognition that something was done on time. If you have an employee that was struggling, just going, hey, great job, you got that in, right? That really means a lot. Jeremy, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think get your teams out there in public, right? Town hall meetings, LinkedIn, even. I've seen some awesome praise come from managers on LinkedIn shouting out their employee wins. That's a big public forum. It takes some confidence as a leader to post your folks out there on LinkedIn and say these guys are rock stars, right? Because you know they're going to get poached. But they're not going to leave because they got such a good manager that's shouting them out on LinkedIn, right? But I think you brought up a really good point there in kind of juxtaposing that against comp, right? Everybody likes some monetary rewards. Um, but depending on how folks are motivated, and I'll tell Mark's um, personal strength surveys, right? Is how do people like to be, what does that come? Is it a $50 Amazon card that really gets somebody motivated? Or is it shout out on the big town hall? It says, "Hey, we want to recognize a win that came from Rhett this past week," or Susan did this incredible job saving an at-risk account for us, right? I've worked with companies that do an unbelievable job of highlighting those couple of wins. 5 minutes on a town hall with a person from each different department. You can build some momentum on that. The next month you do the same thing. The next month you do the same thing, and maybe by the end of the year, the big 25,000 employee, global ed tech company that we worked for, they did, I think, a brilliant job of rolling that up and actually acknowledging quarterly and annual excellence, right? And shouting that out from the rooftop. So I think Chris also did something that was really neat when we highlighted what was going on in our teams at our department head meetings. I saw more than one occasion you'd jot down little notes of what was going on and you'd send that person a note.
Yeah.
And maybe we mentioned, Susie did this great job of knocking out this new enrollment for this big customer that just came on board, and all of a sudden she gets a note from the department's vice president, right? You're talking about folks, behind closed doors, and you're sending out good praise. But if that doesn't somehow get back to them, they don't know. Does it happen if a tree falls in the forest? Did it really happen? The 5 minutes that it took you to jot that little note to them, it says, "Hey, this came up. I'm so pleased. I couldn't be happier. Thank you for going above and beyond." Whatever your note might have said, that can make the world of difference to somebody culturally within a business. And again, I'll echo, especially in a remote environment.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think, you're going to be starting at a relatively small company, right? You work at a small company right now. There's not always funding to buy things or give presents or, sometimes it just has to be words of affirmation or something positive, and I think to the point you just made, it does make a difference. This doesn't have to be some grand gesture. It can be very simple, it doesn't have to cost money to provide recognition, right? So I think that's really important to call out as well. Mark, any thoughts on that one?
No, Jeremy said it well.
Mark's got nothing. All right. All right. And as Jeremy alluded to earlier, we do have a little bit of a bonus tip towards the end here is, going back to our Gartner research, is make sure as a manager you are practicing self-care. Being a manager can be stressful. It's hard. You have to do your job and now you're managing other people. Make sure whenever you can, take care of yourself. And again, that doesn't have to be some expensive trip or something like that. It can be a meditation. I've taken up doing 10 and 20-minute meditations where I just take a step back and just catch my breath. That is a great way to do self-care. Doesn't cost anything, and you don't lose your whole day, but you just take a few minutes to kind of check in with yourself, right? Make sure you're eating well, make sure you're taking breaks, make sure you're getting enough sleep. All of those things are common sense, but you really can start a death spiral if you're not eating well, you're not sleeping well, you're stressed out. Rinse and repeat, and you just keep getting farther down. And any thoughts or suggestions on the self-care, guys, before we wrap up?
I'll just say that it's the number one priority. And as they say on airplanes, and I heard countless number of times, you've got to put your own mask on first before helping others. So if your mask isn't on and you're not feeling good about what you're doing, your team's going to see it. You're not going to be able to support them the way they need, and they're going to notice it. And that's going to cause probably a lot more, questioning, on their part. So, be the example. And I think we said this in our second session. If you're on PTO, be on PTO, set that example. If you need to work some long hours because the big projects do, or, whatever is needed at that time, you set the example, but always communicate with positive intent. But again, you got to put your own mask on first.
Great.
I like
Jeremy?
that one, Mark. The PTO one resonates, right? Lead by example there. Because we do really
100%.
want our folks to take time off and take care of themselves. I made a note, Chris. One of my favorite things to kind of blow off some steam was the walking meetings. And I know companies companies get super keyed in on always wanting you on video. And I find it to be draining, absolutely draining. I think there's a time and a place for it. But some of my favorite discussions that we had over the years were walking around, just chit chatting during our hour. So toss that out there as an idea.
Oh, it's great. We took advantage of the remoteness, during COVID. I think that was probably the best shape I was ever in too, was I could walk for a couple of hours and just go from call to call. It did help me with some of the stress and some of that mental exhaustion of always being on when you're on camera, right? So I agree with that. Red, anything to tie us off with?
No, I think you guys nailed it.
And he's single, ladies. All right, so let's remind everyone of our key takeaways from the conversation today. There's a million things to know as a manager, right? We're not going to be able to cover them all in one podcast, but I do feel like we touched on a lot of things that can make you successful. So to close out, just a quick review of the do's and don'ts. Do set clear expectations. Do foster good communication, but don't micromanage. Do empower your team. Don't avoid conflict resolution. Do provide regular feedback and coaching, but don't be unavailable or uncommunicative. Do recognize and reward your team. And finally, don't forget to take care of yourself. All right. That's the end of our episode. As always, guys, great conversation. I think a lot of good information in there. For everybody listening, thanks for joining us on this episode of the Generational Exchange. We hope the conversation between the generations sparked some new ideas and helped you see the business world from fresh perspectives. Don't forget to subscribe for more insightful discussions across the generations. And if you have a burning business question you'd like us to tackle, leave us a comment or shoot us an email at cmsrconsulting@gmail.com. Until next week, from all of us here at the Generational Exchange, thanks for listening and happy learning.